Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I want to discuss. I'm continuing my discussion on um, our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which he issued following the attack uh, on Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan, which led to the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. Japanese, two-thirds of them were actually were actually American citizens. Um, I've mentioned two of the men in a previous video. Uh, Fred Korematsu, and of course that's a landmark case that we all study in law school. And then the less famous Gordon Hirabayashi's case, and then there's also Hasui versus the United States. So it's interesting. Hasui, he was actually so these three men they decided on principle to challenge the constitutionality of the internment. They were all young men in their 20s, and they were law abiding. In fact, some of them, like Hasri, he actually had a law degree. He had graduated from University of Oregon at the time in 1939, at the time of his internment and conviction for not for refusing the to abide by the internment and the exclusion. So there were three elements. There are three elements to the orders that they were challenging that the cases addressed. Not all the three cases addressed those elements. The three elements were the curfew. There was a curfew. As a result of orders that military orders that were implemented from the executive order 9066. So they included curfews, exclusion, and internment. So Gordon Hirabayashi's case dealt with they all went all the way to the Supreme Court. Gordon Hirabayashi's case dealt with the curfews and exclusion. I mean, well, at least uh, Hasui's case dealt with both the curfew and the exclusion, right? Uh, Korematsu, and I suppose that's why it's more popular, dealt with the internment. And of course, in all three cases, the Supreme Court did what has been described as a stain on American jurisprudence. Somebody went on to describe it also as uh, an odious, their action is as an odious and discredited artifact of popular bigotry. So, in fact, some of the justices that dissent called the decision of the Supreme Court, outright racist. So, um, in all three instances, the Supreme Court ruled that the executive order, the internment, and the laws interning and excluding and restricting Japanese Americans wholesale were constitutional at the time. So I'm going to do subsequent videos analyzing the anti-canon decisions by the Supreme Court. Now, these convictions have all been overturned, right? Except in the case of Hasri. Hasri died in 1986. He had filed a writ of coram nobis in 1983 when it was revealed that there was prosecutorial misconduct, that the Solicitor General Fahey at the time had misled the court. He had actually suppressed evidence that was critical, and he died in 1986, however. But Hirabayashi and Korematsu's convictions were overturned, and there were subsequent events. Now, I'm going to get into analyzing the cases in subsequent videos, but today I think it's very important to tell the backstory of these young men. So these young men at the time, they were young men they were all heroes. They were law-abiding and they were American citizens. But it happened that they were of Japanese ancestry, and this was it was a racist attack on their citizenship just because of their Japanese ancestry. There was no evidence of their disloyalty. There was no issue of their disloyalty, and so they were willing to stick their neck out and challenge the laws in the unconstitutional laws in court. Again, remember that the president has emergency powers, right? The president has emergency powers. In fact, in Masui's case, it was initially in the district court. So a judge called, his name was Judge Fee, Alger Fee. He thought the order, the curfew, the executive order 9066. He said because they were not under martial law, he thought it was unconstitutional. He thought it only applied to aliens, and he said something that was kind of like bizarre. So Masui, even though he was an American citizen, he was born in America, but he had worked in a Japanese consulate briefly, and so the judge, who was not an immigration judge, so he couldn't really decide on this matter. It had not gone to an immigration judge. No one had revoked Masui's citizenship. Judge Fee bizarrely said, well, he thinks the law, that's Roosevelt's law, was unconstitutional, right? He thought it was not a constitutional law, that it can only apply to aliens, it can't apply to American citizens. But he did convict Masui, so by error, saying, well, but Masui isn't now an alien because he worked for the Japanese government, and he thereby automatically revoked his citizenship. There's nothing that says that, right? So anyway, this he did strike his conclusions, his statements regarding, because it was a bizarre, erroneous statement, right? So he did strike that much later on. I'll give the legal analysis later on. But right now, I think these men, in challenging the legality of these bad laws, because it was a time of wartime hysteria. It was, the internment was based on racism, wartime hysteria, and regardless, they did, there could have been less restrictive measures that could have been taken, right? That would not outright vilify, law-abiding American citizens. Anyway, so let me give their backstory. I mentioned Masui. Masui they all had excellent records. Masui was a graduate of law school, and he decided to challenge the curfew and the exclusion. So because he thought it was racist. He thought it was discriminating against Japanese Americans, and so in fact he had initially been working as a military reservist, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 by the Empire of Japan. He resigned. And he resigned his job. But he refused to comply with the curfew and the exclusion orders, and so he went to turn himself in at the police station, saying that he was in Oregon or something. I think it was, this was on the West Coast, right? So the orders, the executive order by Roosevelt gave the Secretary of War powers to restrict certain areas, right? Restrict or exclude people from certain areas. It didn't specifically state a race or a nationality. And of course, Lieutenant General DeWitt, he subsequently issued a number of proclamations, orders. Of course, one of them including, was it the civilian? There was a civilian exclusion order. There was, so a number of them, and basically imposing curfews on Japanese Americans. So it did target Japanese Americans, placing curfews on Japanese Americans, excluding them, and then placing them wholesale, over 120,000 of them, in internment camps. And during that process, they lost their businesses, their property, they lost their livelihood. They were just put in this in a concentration camp that was like a mass prison, so without trial. So that's mass suspension of habeas corpus. Remember that yes, the president does have these emergency powers, but again, it's an emergency, and there's still supposed to be judicial oversight. The guardrail is there's supposed to be judicial review um, to test their constitutionality, because it's supposed to be an emergency. And it's supposed to be limited, and there are standards of review that the courts can use to see if the president has exercised some kind of executive overreach, if because if there are less restrictive means that he can use, then he should do it and not violate the constitution, people's constitutional rights. Now, think about an emergency power this way. Like it was an emergency that ostensibly brought cops to my house, right? A guy called Jide, where I was suborned to go and file an emergency evaluation petition, saying I was going through some kind of crisis, I was dangerous, falsely stating that I was mentally ill. No, not he didn't state I was mentally ill, because he didn't. Got to see the thing. He didn't see he didn't state an illness, but he falsified actions. He said, I took certain actions. He falsely said something about getting shot and things like that. All these things were just falsified, right? And so the emergency evaluation petition is okay. Let me not talk about my situation, but let me say what it is. So it's because normally, everybody has due process of law. So with an emergency evaluation petition, it's temporary. A judge can order, if they find probable cause, take away your rights, and just take them to an hospital to do an evaluation, to avoid a risk, because there's an imminent risk of danger. So the same, but it's temporary, and later on you can get to challenge it, right? But the idea, it's a risky provision. The same thing with the emergency war powers of the president that are in the Constitution, right? It's temporary, and it's to protect national security or the interest of Americans and things like that. In this case, right, so there's a judicial process, a judicial standard to review it, to see, okay, is there a less restrictive measure that the president can use and still achieve the same outcome, right? I'll get into the analysis later on. So there was clearly executive overreach in this case. That's been the verdict, and of course it's been overturned. So again, it's called the Korematsu internment laws. Korematsu internment cases, Korematsu, Hirabayashi, Masui, they've all been called anti-canon law, right? They're bad law. So these young men were challenging the constitutionality of the cases. So now, in Gordon Hirabayashi's case, he was a student. He would later on go on to earn a bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and he became a renowned sociologist. He became a professor and chair of the sociology department at University of Alberta in Canada. That was where he died at the age of 93. He would go on to win the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor an American civilian can have. Just like Korematsu as well, he would go on to to get a presidential medal of honor as well. Now Hirabayashi, right, when he was convicted, right, eventually he would go on to, he requested, when he was convicted, he requested to serve in a hard labor camp, and so he hitchhiked all the way to the prison, because the the government didn't have money for his train fare, right? So he hitchhiked him, all the way there, and by the time he got there, they said he'd arrived a couple of weeks late, so they didn't have his paperwork. So they were going to let him go. They were just going to let him just go back home, right? But he insisted, that he would serve his time. His conviction, even though he had been held in prison he'd been held in jail for about 5 months, pending his trial. He was convicted, of 2 counts, uh, with each having, was it, um, 90 days, and he served them consecutively, right? So 90 days is approximately 3 months. So 6 months, he still had to go and do 6 months. So he served in what was known as the Catalina Federal Honor Camp. And he was breaking rocks, hard manual labor. He was breaking rocks to build a highway. So he was there. But eventually, it's funny with history. After everything was done, that honor that prison site was renamed after him. It's been abolished. It's no longer a prison. It's in a forest park. Of course, it was situated in a national forest park. It's been abandoned. It's now named in his honor. It's called the Gordon Hirabayashi Recreation Site. And so it's interesting though. So after he served his time for failing to abide by the internment, he also went on to serve 1 year in McNeil, in the federal penitentiary in McNeil. So because he refused to sign up for the armed forces, because there was a there was an oath he had to take, a declaration renouncing the allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, and he thought that was racist. He thought that was racially discriminatory, because other people did not have to do so, right? To renounce allegiance to any emperor or anything like that. And so he thought Japanese Americans were being singled out. So this has been the remarkable thing about Americans, minorities and Americans, and people who are marginalized, is that they can challenge the constitutionality of laws, and they can assert their rights. Of course, this is something that I've been trying to do in my own case, in my own little way. Of course, nobody knows of me. Nobody knows. Nobody's even paid heed to what I've been going through, the violations. I've been talking about how I've been wrongfully detained through subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, and this was to obstruct justice and impede, um, you know, equal employment opportunity complaints I'd filed legitimately against discrimination as well. In the federal government, working in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, I filed an Office of Special Counsel complaint. I filed Inspector General complaint. So I was doing the right thing, but I find I'm getting pushback and being discriminated against. And then I was raided. I was framed. And I've been locked up, my rights have been violated, so things that are unconstitutional, and here I am saying, hey, that this something unconstitutional is going on. So to me, Korematsu, Hirabayashi, these were heroes. Masui, these were young men who were American citizens. They were law-abiding. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were loyal, and they were, challenging the constitutionality of what was going, the discrimination against them because of their race. So he ended up serving a year. That's Gordon Hirabayashi. He ended up serving a year in prison for refusing to sign up for the armed forces because of the required renunciation of the allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, which he thought was discriminatory against Japanese people, Japanese Americans. Um, so later on in life, he died. He lived to be 93 years old. He died in Canada, but he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's 11 years prior to his death. Unfortunately, but he lived a very productive life, and he became a human rights activist as well. And of course, he was a professor and chair of the sociology department at University of Alberta in Canada. And Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu was very brave, because what is ironic is that the Japanese Americans who were being discriminated against, over 120,000 of them, and it was these young men who were on based on principle resisting, they were actually stigmatized and ostracized by the majority of Japanese people who complied with the discriminatory law, uh, putting them in concentration camps. They complied with it, and so people were isolating them, like people like Fred. They were isolating Korematsu. Nobody wanted to be seen around him because they didn't want to be viewed as making trouble, because obviously they were being watched, right? They were being watched, so they were alienated. They were criticized for being arrogant, by their own people, by other Japanese Americans who complied with the abuse, with the discrimination. Now, I hate the idea of re-victimizing the victim, because considering that, well, the Japanese Americans were being discriminated by being placed in these internment camps, but I'm just trying to point out the uh, the heroism of these young men, for the fact that they were fighting for something for all Japanese people, all minorities, saying, look, America is violating its own laws, its own values by, instituting these odious laws against them, people who were loyal American citizens. But he had no support amongst his people. In fact, the ACLU would not help Hirabayashi. They would, because the ACLU was supported, by the Democratic Party, which was Roosevelt's party. So they didn't want to take his case. They didn't want to take Gordon Hirabayashi's case. It's funny. This is my situation as well. I wrote ACLU. The ACLU did not help me. Everybody said go to the ACLU. That's American Civil Liberties. Is it union, or I don't know what the LU stands for. But I went to them, wrote them several times. They didn't take my case. I went to EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, run by Brian Stevenson. Somebody I used to admire. Several times when I was locked up, they didn't take my case. I understand. They said, well, that they're dealing with people who are going through life sentences, and things like that, so they don't have sufficient resources. So something I've learned about the criminal justice and injustice in America is that there really is injustice because minorities, marginalized people do not have access to legal services to help them, right? They don't have access. And I have a law degree. So by God's grace, I know what I will do with my law degree when this is over. Everything that has a beginning has an expiration date, right? Everything has all troubles have an expiration date. My name is Olurotimi Osha. It's gotten dark, so I'm just going to end this here. Later on, I'm going to get into the analysis of the legal issues. And so these are brave men. One thing I wanted to quickly mention, I've mentioned it before, about how Fred Korematsu, he actually did plastic surgery so he could, hide his identity and escape, capture, because, it was challenging the law, that this was discriminatory, that how are they going to just intern over 120,000 people, most of them American citizens, just based on their appearance, their phenotype, Japanese ancestry, right? So, there was no evidence of their disloyalty. J. Edgar Hoover, who was FBI director, he told the president, he said, no, that there's no evidence that the Japanese Americans, that there was any risk of sabotage or spying, amongst them, right? Even Roosevelt didn't want to do it, but Americans just basically got uh, there was wartime hysteria and racism going on. It was very palpable then. So it was political pressure. It was, again, hey, it happens. But let me cut this short here. Again, I've given my spiel about being wrongfully detained and under subordination of perjury and fraud on the court. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.